Pardon the interruption. I'm Amy Poppinga. Sam, you were gone for the 4th of July. Did you happen to bring Chris and I anything?
I did. I was at the store and I was thirsty and I was looking around. And you know what I saw for you, Amy? Look at that. Amy. For Chris. Christopher. In fact, one of our good friends, Professor Christopher Moore, I saw this sitting on the shelf. You know what I didn't see? I didn't see a Sam.
Oh.
There's not really a joke here. I just want to be included. Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I'm Sam Mulberry. Amy, we are into Unit 2.
We are.
Deep into Unit 2 at this point. Before we start to talk about Unit 2 stuff, though, I want to spend a moment. This is our first chance to really talk with students after the first exam. So I want to spend a little time thinking about kind of what we noticed looking at that first exam.
Yes. So first of all, I just want to congratulate everybody on the fact that the first one is behind us now. And as we kind of mentioned before, I do think that everybody tends to improve on the second one just because you have your timing figured out. You have that down a little bit better. Some real strengths that I noticed. So let's start with strengths. Some significant strengths that I noticed was utilizing examples from the readings as well as from the museums. And that's definitely what we want to see. So for example, when it came to essay responses, if instead of just talking about the characteristics of sort of pre-Edict of Milan Christianity and post-Edict of Milan Christianity, you actually used examples, and you talked about someone like Perpetua as an example of living in a culture where you're being persecuted for your faith, and then sort of contrasted that with a figure like St. Anthony. So really using actual people that are mentioned and then sort of tying your description to those people was definitely a real strength. And so props to those of you that did that. If as you're looking at your essay grading, be aware of that. If you're kind of a little bit dissatisfied with your grade, it's very likely that may have been why. And so take a look and see how specific were you. Kind of also then tied to the connection questions on a sort of a similar observation was that if people sort of went beyond just saying, here's who this person is, here's who this person is, and then many of my students chose to do Socrates and Plato. So if you just said that the connection was that Socrates was the teacher of Plato, well, that's right, that's accurate, but those of you that pushed it further to say, here's the ways in which Socrates was answering questions differently than Plato, here's how Plato was influenced by Socrates, here's how we hear the voice of Socrates through Plato, that's really what we were looking for. And people were quite able to do that. Even it doesn't mean they went on for paragraphs and paragraphs. I had some really nice, really tight responses that were just about a paragraph long that were able to kind of succinctly get at sort of that little bit of a deeper idea. And
yeah, so, I mean, I think the when I looked at the connections, I actually thought they were stronger than the essays for me, which surprised me because sometimes the connections, although it's fewer points, like that's tough. The connections are tough.
Yep.
The people who did well are the ones who took an extra beat to say, but why does this matter?
Exactly.
So it's
like, what's the next question? Well, tell me why. And then
exactly.
they
so if we talked
that.
about Alexander or something, the people who said sort of he conquered, he Hellenized, that's good. People talked about why Hellenization mattered. That was great.
Exactly.
So I would say that. I would say that one of the big things that I noticed on the essay, so this is maybe turning now towards some of the things where I think students almost across the board could have been a little stronger, at least in my group, was they looked at that essay and they wrote about it in terms of the change that happened in the church was Christians were persecuted, now it's legal. But kind of like we were saying with connections, why does that matter?
Yeah.
And I had a couple essays that were great. The people who made that next step to say, and here's how the church changed. Here's how the relationship between the church and the empire changed. That's really getting at the core.
Yes.
And because if you look at what the question asked, it said, to talk about two of those big CWC questions, and it's really hard to do that if you're only looking at the legalization of Christianity.
Exactly. And so I think I had an excellent essay where the student really focused on the notion of what does it mean to be a powerful church? And how would power have been defined prior to the Edict of Milan? And then how was power kind of defined more traditionally after? And what were the benefits of that? And yet at the same time, what was really lost in that? And so it was that kind of answer that sort of pushed a little bit beyond the surface that I think we are looking for and think that you're quite capable of. So just kind of think about that moving forward, that often I think when you start, you are focused on sort of the skeleton, you get the ideas out there, but then really sort of revisit and say, how am I actually fleshing out those ideas?
Talking about moving forward, Amy, I'm going to lob up a big softball to you here. As we look at the Middle Ages,
yes,
right?
We've moved into the Middle Ages.
Right, two of the big structures of the Middle Ages that students sometimes get confused about, often just unsure what the differences are. Feudalism, manorialism.
Potato. No, they're not. They're different, and so we need to recognize that. So let's start with feudalism. So feudalism, if we want to sort of start small and build out, we can quite simply sort of think of feudalism as the political structure of the time, the system that was in place that provided some stability and structure to the ways in which people were organizing themselves in terms of politics, and then really security, the sort of security for safety around you, and something that comes up all the time in Unit 2, and hopefully this will already be familiar to you, is the notion of hierarchy. And so when we think about feudalism and manorialism here in just a second, we are always thinking about a hierarchical system, a structure where everybody could figure out where do they fit on the ladder, on the chain, on the sort of triangle of authority. And so with feudalism, with this political system that we have a system of sort of loyalty and sort of servanthood in exchange for land or protection. Mm-hmm. And so
it's how the wealthy people, how the wealthy are powerful, how you raise an army.
Right, exactly. And so you would have your king at the top. Beneath that, the king has lords who would be our wealthy landowners, our nobility class. And then below the lords, we would have knights and vassals who would pledge their loyalty to those lords, who ultimately pledge their loyalty to the king in exchange for their own portions of land as well as protection. Mm-hmm. And so,
this is a small group of people.
And this is a very small group of people. So we're talking about, if you put that all together, 10% of the population. So very, very few people are actually sort of operating in this, I guess I would say, a little bit more prestigious type of position. However, where we can find the rest of us, the 90% of us, more applicable is thinking about the system of manorialism. So manorialism, also a hierarchical structure. If we think about feudalism as being the political structure, we think about manorialism as being the economic structure. This is how people are sort of, quote, working and getting paid, even though they're not getting paid monetarily, they're not earning money. But 90% of that 90% would all sort of be at the very bottom level. So if we think about a triangle, this bottom level is the biggest. This is where the vast majority of us are. And these are people who are, these are serfs or peasants. Same thing. These are people who are working the land, and the land that they're working is that same land we talked about as being owned by the Lord up here at this sort of like third layer, if we will. And so these people are all working in the fields, and they are, doing all of the hard manual labor. And in exchange for doing that labor for the Lord allows them to live on the land, be protected by this system of feudalism, that if they stay on that land, they are protected, usually living in very basic types of housing. And everybody's kind of working communally. So you would have a communal sort of center of the land, a town where you would share, you would share the mill, you would share the ovens, you would all be working the same land. And so you get protection in exchange, you can live on the land, and then you're also given some level of the harvest yourself. So you're kind of given enough food to feed your family. The kind of key thing I think here to focus on is that nobody gets to move really out of whatever layer they are. So nobody says to themselves, well, we're going to start out here down at the bottom layer, and we'll work hard, and we'll train our kids, and we'll get our own place.
Right.
That's not going to happen.
And that's really probably the thing that's maybe most foreign to us as 21st century Westerners.
Right. The harder I work, the greater the reward, right. And that was not the case for this.
But these are pretty strict categories.
Yep.
So if we're thinking about kind of things that can that we as 21st century people can learn from the Middle Ages, do you have anything that jumps out at you where it's like, this is actually a lesson as a modern Christian?
And I think that this is going to move us maybe, depending on how caught up you are with your reading or how, kind of what you remember from the museum. I think for me, really, the lesson of the Middle Ages comes in what Christianity looked like, in the respect that I think sometimes on the surface, a student response to the Middle Ages is like, oh, these people had a very warped concept of God. It was all about like punishment and sort of earning your way and believing that you probably wouldn't. Actually thinking it was sort of like a system that was set up and was designed for you to fail. And yet at the same time, and so that makes God seem very distant, I think, and again, very much just about punishment. Humans are frail and sinful, and we can't even remotely think about even being close to God or being in the presence of God. And yet at the same time, all throughout the Middle Ages, whether it's the early Middle Ages and figures like St. Benedict, who's I think really interesting, and his sister St. Scholastica, and then on as we go here through figures we're going to encounter in the Middle Ages, or in the sort of later Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, like Hildegard of Bingen, or then as we move towards the end of the unit, some people all save. We see these very real and personal interactions with the divine, and not necessarily personal the way we would think about them in today, in today's time, or the way that we would define them. But yet, like, this commitment to God loves me and he reveals himself to me in ways that kind of work outside the established system. And so I think in particular, when we talk about people that have visions, or people who sort of recognize the power of God through what they are observing supernaturally, there aren't the mechanisms in place yet to really probe or understand what would have been called supernatural, what's happening in the cosmos, what can be observed through nature. There weren't the systems or mechanisms to understand those really any other way than the idea that this is part of God's work, or this is God's vastness and God's greatness. And I think that's something to pay attention to. Often today I think we can be really dismissive of that because we, quote, know better. And yet at the same time, I think it's actually a reflection to us, or a thought about the ways in which God is always breaking through, I think, always sort of speaking into a culture that sort of breaks the norm or works outside of whatever the system is humans have established. And so to me, that's kind of the lesson of the Middle Ages, is that, when you think about things in their cultural context, instead of being dismissive of them as that has no value or impact anymore, really looking for, okay, how was God speaking into that particular historical or cultural context?
For me, I would say it's attached to that, the big lesson that I take away, and that has to do with, for medieval Christians, as much as we talk about like their focus is on the world to come, we talk about how short lifespans are and how the thing that really matters is the life to come. For as much as we say that, this life mattered to them. I think the perfect picture of that is when we look at the sacrament of penance. Now, this sometimes gets caricatured, I think, in when we get to the Reformation, and I think even by contemporary Protestants, where you get this sense of like, well, why do you need to confess your sins to a priest? Why wouldn't you can just confess that to God? But the thing that I think people don't pay attention to, and here's where my Catholic school education comes in, is that when you go to penance, if we need to pay attention to the order of things. So you go, you confess your sins. The next step, so that's contrition. The next step is absolution. So the next thing the priest says is, basically lets you know God has forgiven you. So in terms of your relationship with God, the confession of that sin, God has forgiven you. Penance isn't about God forgiving you or you needing to pay God back. Penance doesn't have to do with God. Penance has to do with making things right in this world. Mm-hmm. This life matters. Yeah. And that's why purgatory makes sense, is because if it doesn't happen here, that sort of dealing with the ramifications of sin, it has to happen in the life to come. That's, I think, something that I wish 21st century Protestant Christians thought about sometimes.
And I think of how that idea plays into what it means to be part of a community. So penance is making things right in your community. Penance is because your actions and, potentially the negative actions have had an impact on those around you. And so, yes, I think we lose sight of that. And again, as wonderful it is to sort of live in this cloud of I'm forgiven, and that at the same time that earthly penance is not supposed to be a reminder of how sinful one is or how bad they are, but rather is supposed to say, yes, you are forgiven, but now you need to make it right because your actions don't just affect you. And I think that is definitely something that we can sometimes disregard, or think our relationship is just between us and God. So if it's right between us and God, then that should be it. That's the end of it.
So I mean, you're a bit of a world traveler, right? I guess. Fashion yourself that way, right?
I fancy myself a world traveler.
If students were going to go
I'm like Marco Polo. That's what they call me.
If students were going to go visit some of the places that we talk about here, in terms of, if you were to take summer's a great time to take a trip to Europe. Once the course is over, you have that month before the semester starts. If a student was going to go to Europe and wanted to sort of explore some of the things we're talking about, some of these medieval sites, do you have anything that jumps out at you that either you've seen or you would be high on your list of things you want to see?
I don't, because it's been so, I traveled through Europe in high school, and so probably might do better if we had this conversation about which Hard Rock cafes.
So what is the best just offhand?
I guess Paris. But maybe it doesn't matter anymore. Do those even still exist?
I was at one in Munich in January to watch a football game.
But I actually really enjoy Ireland and England. And so looking at Celtic Christianity, you can go visit the Book of Kells in Dublin. And so I think Celtic Christianity, and again, kind of this element of mysticism, is really fascinating when you look at all of these incredible churches that have been built that were, built by monks, again, as sort of this act of this lasting this lasting commitment to God through today, the expansion of Christianity throughout England into present-day Scotland and then over into Ireland. So you are probably better suited to pinpoint a place in Europe. So, but I just would say in general, I think that, I think too, sometimes actually the Irish experience gets neglected.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
Anywho, but for you.
Two pieces of advice. The first is not specific to a place. It's really anywhere, which is when you go to these old European cities, notice that you're going to find cathedrals there. They're going to be there. Just look up and you're going to see that. And one of the things I would say, they're beautiful to look at. Now, when you go to them, they often feel like they're sort of an artifact, or they're like a really nice museum where you can go look at some old stuff. And I would say that's fine, but if you really want to experience something, remember that most of these are also still active churches. So go to a church service. I mean, one of my favorite things, so when we take students to Europe in odd number Januaries for World War I, there's my requisite plug, we do this. So we go to cathedrals, things like this. One of the best is we go to Evensong at Westminster. And it's great because you can pay a lot of money and go through Westminster and see where this person was buried and see this and that. And that stuff's really interesting. And you should do that. But what's really cool is you're actually, when you go to Evensong, you're sitting in the choir loft, you're listening to this amazing choir, you're singing along with this amazing choir, and you're using this space for the purpose it was created for, which is fascinating.
I agree with that. And when we, our family lived in England for a time, and there were Saturdays where for fun we just took the bus. We took the bus. And it had like a route that if you stayed on the bus for the entire route, it would take you about 3 hours probably. And windy roads, kind of what you think of as, what you think of as rural England. And so that 3-hour journey on the bus was actually probably, it was in kilometers, I guess, but it was actually probably like maybe 20 miles. I mean, and we actually, for the most time we lived there, never moved beyond these 20 miles. But we would stop in all these small towns, and one of the towns that we visited, which wasn't too far from where we lived, had, and every town has these beautiful old stone churches, but there was a church in this one particular town, and it was built in the 15th century, so it's a little late here on the medieval timeline.
That's barely medieval.
It's barely, it's brand new, basically. But anyway, point being that in all these small towns, the church is just, there's always an open door. It would be like Saturday afternoon, and the doors would be open, the organist would often be practicing, and we could just wander in and sit down. And this particular church was the Church of Sir Walter Raleigh. But I just thought that's such an interesting thing. It's because the placement of churches, because as you hopefully have learned in the museum, life built itself around the church. So the church was at the heart of the town center, which I feel like is very different today. I can't imagine today you're just walking around, you're like, let's just wander into the church. But it very much had this open feel of this is at the heart of the community, and the church doors aren't closed. If you want to wander in and sit down and kind of have a respite while somebody is practicing the organ, nobody thinks it's strange or weird. And just a very special kind of, a special kind of experience that feels, again, much more a part of the community.
And if you want to go to a specific place that has that feel, my favorite church in the world is Chartres Cathedral in France, because it's not Paris.
The mega church of the time.
That's right. You have to go about an hour outside of Paris. So you're in this smaller town, and the town is kind of built on the hill, and at the pinnacle of that hill is this amazing cathedral. And it's a super holy place for me, but it is also it really epitomizes what we're talking about in terms of the Gothic cathedral style, and in terms of the church being the centerpiece of life in the Middle Ages. Amy, before we end this segment, I have it on good authority that you know a little bit about Islam. So this is your chance. We're going to give you 2 minutes ISO ball for Amy Poppinga here to talk Islam, correct anything you want to make sure students understand.
Yeah, no, I guess so. Number one, I appreciate that the way that we teach this course makes room for the importance of the development of Islam as it plays a role in not only world history at the time frame that we're covering, but actually does have an impact on, sort of what's shaping Christianity, what's happening culturally, and as we move on in Unit 2 and towards the end of the time frame that we're studying, there is what's sort of referred to as the Islamic Golden Age, and that doesn't happen in isolation. It very much happens in conjunction with what's happening in Europe, and we have pockets of Europe, what's present-day Spain, moving up towards France, that are kind of some of these earliest examples, actually, of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society where you had Christian, Jewish, as well as Islamic philosophers, thinkers, authors living together in, harmony is kind of maybe, I don't know about harmony all the time, but actually a lot of interesting interaction between their ideas. And so Islam isn't something that should be seen as separate. The impact that Islamic thinkers and philosophers have, Averroes or Ibn Rushd, his Arabic name, who you've been exposed to, we wouldn't have actually writings from certain Christian authors we're getting to had we not had Averroes act as a bridge between early Latin thinkers and then moving that into and making it available when so much of Europe for a significant period of time was in the Dark Ages, where people weren't writing things down and things had been burned and all of this kind of stuff. And so I think, so number one, just to recognize that we don't include Islam as a form of tokenism. It's not just there because we thought, we should try to add that in. And that's actually one of the reasons we really like your Bachman text, because Bachman does a really nice job, I think, of giving more accuracy to the weight of the Islamic Empire and the contributions that it makes intellectually. And so that's not so much about what I would want to clear up about Islam. When it comes to Islam, the religion, I think that it's, Islam can be a very controversial topic in our current context. And yet what I would hope that we would keep in mind as we study this past is that when I hear people say something like Islam and Christianity, they've always been in tension, it's always been that way, it'll always be that way, that's actually not the case. And that's just not an opinion. That's sort of historically proven. And we have, again, not just writing that proves that, but we have archaeology to help us prove it. And we can see influences in architecture in certain places throughout Europe, and that it hasn't just been a story of battle between either two religious groups or different ethnic groups since the dawn of Islam. That's just not the case. And like I said, that's one of the reasons I actually love teaching, quote, religious history, or being somebody who's a scholar of Islam and yet at the same time is rooted in a history department, because I actually find that theology can feel very threatening to us. And so not that it isn't important to think about theological differences or to understand those theological differences. Those are often our biggest questions. Those are the things that we have the most sort of interest in. But yet at the same time, the history matters too, because history kind of speaks to, I think, our hearts and our minds in a slightly different way. And it can really help to dispel some of the sometimes, I think, inaccurate prejudices, critiques, understandings that we may have. And sometimes we have those and we like to hold on to them because they might reinforce some of the theological things we find threatening. But if we can sort of say, hey, this is actually fact over here, and if we can start over here, and if we can kind of familiarize ourselves with it, I think it makes us more open to not some kind of theological pluralism, not saying that we all have to think the same thing, but understanding that if we really want to understand these differences, we need to start by thinking about why we might hold on to some of the information that is actually inaccurate. And so then the final thing is just to consider that I think a common misnomer about Islam is the notion that sort of if we were making a comparison chart, which I actually think are useless when it comes to discussing religions at all. So if you come across comparison charts, I just think don't learn about other religions that way, because what that means when we have a comparison chart is we're always privileging the first category, or the first set of boxes. So we'd start with our Christian box, and then we say, oh, here's what Jews think, here's what Muslims think, compared to what we already think. And it just doesn't work like that with religion. And so when we think about Islam, I think we tend to go, oh, Jesus is to Christianity what Muhammad is to Islam. And that's not the case at all. Muhammad is not divine in any way. Muslims do believe that God performs miracles through Muhammad, and that Muhammad's greatest miracle, or that God performs through Muhammad, is the revealing of the Quran, the holy book of Muslims, to Muhammad. So Muhammad is not the author of the Quran, and nor is Muhammad divine in any way, shape, or form. He was a human, and so because of that, he has a human nature, which means that he lived as a human and functioned as a human. And Muhammad also fulfills a very different role than Jesus in terms of his role in his community. So while Jesus, I think actually, even though he was it was hoped that Jesus would be a political leader and that Jesus would be, even a sort of military leader that, and as Jesus was often asked, you came to be the king, right? Like, you're going to help us you're going to be another Judas Maccabees. You're going to help us overthrow this empire that's oppressing us. And Jesus was so clear, which I actually really like, about saying, no, that's not what I'm here to do. Yes, I'm here to establish a kingdom, but like, it's my Father's kingdom, and that means something different. Muhammad's role was different from the view of Islam. Muhammad was not divine. He was someone that functioned first as a religious leader, but then becomes a political and military and community leader as well. And because of that, the man of Muhammad functions in all of those various categories and what's combined with that type of responsibility for a human. So I think then we have to think about, when we look at Muhammad, or we look at Muhammad's actions, or people say certain things about Muhammad, they have to keep it in context of, this is not a comparison to say what Jesus said he was, or what Jesus was established to do. So I could go on and on, as you know, and that was probably more than 2 minutes. So.
All right, we'll be back with Make the Case.
Welcome back. It's segment number 2, which I think is probably the best segment, right? Because this is the segment where we play a game, which is also educational. So to recap to this point...
Nothing like educational games, Chris. That really puts butts in the seats, right?
There's no education happening other places in this webisode, just in this game. So to recap, we've had 2 of these games so far in our continuing tournament of edutainment throughout the summer. I believe Amy won the first.
She did.
And then, miraculously, Amy and I tied, which I don't think is ever... We had a draw. I guess having 6 defenders in the back line really paid off, and I held off her offense. Now, one of you went on and voted for like a third-party candidate.
I'm claiming that vote.
Okay. So, anyway, it's a tight competition. Sam's looking to make a comeback as we play our second installment of Make the Case, everyone's favorite. We should do like a home game version of this.
That's right. We'll work on that for you.
Okay, so Sam, can you remind us how we play Make the Case?
Yeah, so we have 3 questions that Chris and I are going to debate. These are sealed envelopes, so we don't know which answer we're going to get. We're going to pick those randomly and have a great debate. Chris, what is our first question?
Our first question is this. We kind of hinted at this in the first segment. Hildegard of Bingen had a mystical experience of God, true or false?
All right, I'm going to let you go first.
Oh, great. Let me make the same John Carson.
That's right. That no one gets.
I will be going false. I get to be the skeptic in this. Sam, I think your wife is about the age of Hildegard.
Sure.
Right, at the same time, if Ann-Britt came home to you, if you came home and Ann-Britt said, you know what, Sam?
Am I being cross-examined right now?
Kind of.
Okay.
You know what, Sam? I had this amazing vision. It was like my heart was afire, and all of Scripture was revealed unto me. And by the way, I saw this woman the size of a city who was half fishnet, and little darking creatures came through her, spit out, and this figure throned in fire spoke unto them. Would you say, oh, sure, God revealed something to you?
I think my response would be crazy, right?
Right. So let me play the 21st century post-scientific revolution rationalist skeptic and say, this is crazy talk. She clearly hallucinated. She's a very bright, accomplished person, but there is something going on here. And if I heard this from anyone else, I would certainly not credit it. And, there's the kind of the part of me that wonders, there's a lot of religious experience out there. I'm not sure we credit this. I'm not sure I like the idea of people just getting direct revelation from God. This often in religious history leads to some rather unorthodox beliefs. Often it's manipulated. I'll put it out there. I would not believe this if I heard it from anyone else. So why should I believe it if it's 1,000 years old? There's no way for us to verify this. Sam, make the true case.
Okay, I really appreciate the scientific, rational argument here. The problem is, Chris, I actually got the winning argument here, because the problem is, as a person of faith, your argument denies God the power to do that. I'm not saying God does it every day. God speaks to everyone. But are you actually making the argument that this is outside of God's ability? Because it's not. I mean, of course he can do this. We have in Scripture, we have examples of God talking to people. We have examples of mysticism within Scripture, right? Paul's conversion experience comes through a mystical type experience. I mean, we see this throughout the Bible. So why would we say Hildegard of Bingen isn't? I mean, unless you're going to deny that power to God. I mean, I really, actually, being completely honest with you here, like I am a 21st century American. Like, I have all the responses you do. And my response to your cross-examination is correct. I would think, wow, wasn't that a weird dream? I mean,
Yeah,
that's what I would
right,
say, right?
right,
Like, or
right.
or if this was something that she said happened to her waking, I would think of all the chemical questions. I would think of all, like, did you eat something weird? Anything like that. But as a person of faith, I really struggle with the thought that I cannot be open to this. So even though I'm a 21st century person, even though I'm a rational, scientific person, I have to be open to that. And I really think you have to. If you're going to close off that, then you're probably closing off other things you're not. As a person of faith, it's going to be really hard to close off. We're going to talk about the Enlightenment towards the end of this course, and what happens when you take those rational arguments and apply them to faith. You start having to cut off quite a bit of religion.
True. So I won't make a rebuttal. I'll just suggest, if you want to like start a thread in the course extension board for this unit, a really good one would be how do we evaluate these claims, right? Because like at some level I agree entirely with you, and part of me wants to say, well, that was true of Old and New Testament times. I don't believe in speaking in tongue. I'm not a Pentecostal. Like, I mean, I've already decided there are certain other things that are evidenced in Scripture that don't happen anymore. So why couldn't this be another? But I think that's a good question. Like, how would we assess this?
And how open are our hearts supposed to be? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good one. Next question, Chris.
Okay. Do you want to read this one?
Go ahead.
Okay. You go first this time. Thomas Aquinas is the greatest Christian theologian since Augustine. True or false? I think we just should call this
very fascinating.
True or false. I don't even know what I'm going to say.
I'm just going to open this like an ape and just tear into it. All right.
Wow, you get to be the skeptic this time.
False. He is not. And here's why. Aquinas, unbelievably important. I mean, he's a brilliant guy. But the question isn't, is Aquinas brilliant? The question isn't, is Aquinas the most brilliant mind of the Middle Ages? That's not what the question is. Is he the most important? I want to get this correct. Is he the most, or is he the greatest theologian since Augustine? And here's why he's not. Because he doesn't actually move theology in his time that far. I mean, in lots of ways, he's explaining or building the foundations under what the church taught. People don't look at Aquinas as they look at him as radical in terms of some of his methods, but I think where he lands is not radically different. I think if you want to look at who the greatest theologians are, and you can disagree with these people, are the people who really push the theological discourse in some pretty challenging and important ways. I think we're going to see this when we get to the Reformation. I think those are probably greater theologians in terms of their contributions. This is not to diminish Aquinas in terms of his ability, in terms of the work he does, but in terms of how that pushes the theological discourse. I think that's a lot. You can talk theology for a long time without bringing up Aquinas. You need to talk about Augustine. You need to talk about Paul. You probably need to talk about Luther, Calvin, people like that. I'm not sure that Aquinas is an essential figure for that conversation.
So I think that I'm going to make the argument for Aquinas because I think he represents a lot of things that we, in our context, would tend to undervalue. First of all, he's old. We have recency bias, and so we want to think about things that happen closer to our own time.
Like 500 years ago.
Well, yeah. Second of all, he's Catholic. I totally disagree with what you just said. I don't know how you can possibly talk about theology in a Christian context without dealing with Aquinas, because he, 1,000 years later, is still the most important Roman Catholic theologian. I mean, there are other doctors at the church, but they all have to deal with Thomistic philosophy. I mean, and so he's an incredibly significant figure in the largest Christian tradition throughout time, and even here in the 21st century. And the other thing is, I mean, I hear what you say, he doesn't write elegantly. He doesn't write persuasively. It's laborious. It's rigid.
It's about method.
It's about method. And so it doesn't resonate in the same way as Augustine, right? Who, all of his philosophy and theology in some way is working out from the Confessions, right? Or like Luther, who's this pastoral theologian and a polemicist who intentionally is provocative. So it's not as fun to read him. And you're right, he's not doing anything quite as new, but that just reveals, again, how we're living in a post-Enlightenment age where discovery is the greatest intellectual accomplishment possible. What he's doing is synthesis, right, and commentary. I mean, he is trying to build something that will endure out of the past. And that's something, as Protestants and as moderns, we are hardwired to think is not all that impressive. I'm really struck by it. This has become kind of my scholarly career. I don't feel like I ever do anything new. All I'm doing is recovering things for people, or synthesizing things, or giving a new, we should look back at this in a new kind of way. I think that's actually highly important, and it's why it's endured. Like, it's why that's lasted. Where a lot of the flavor of the moment type theologians, who I'm not even sure who you're going to name, is like, who is the greatest since Augustine, they don't hold up. I mean, 1,000 years later, we'll see if Schleiermacher, right, or Bultmann, or I'm not sure.
I would argue
Calvin
someone
is.
like I would argue someone like Calvin would be essential to that conversation, probably.
I mean, yeah, if you're I mean, again, like,
Again,
how
he's
do we,
got
how do we
500
decide
years,
that,
so it's
though?
not like it was like 20 minutes ago that.
No,
Calvin.
I know, but like the Reformed tradition, because there are a lot of Protestants who don't think very highly of Calvin.
Sure.
I mean, like,
But I'm saying essential to the conversation. I mean, and
Okay.
I realize I'm defining the playing field a little bit here too, in terms of what greatness means.
okay. So I don't know. This might be the tiebreaker. Sam, the 14th century. I'm going first, right?
Yes,
okay,
sir.
Chris, the 14th century is the worst century in human history. True or false? You just handed me one. I'm a little suspicious
I
of
let you
this.
pick. I don't even know which one I want. for
Okay.
this.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. Okay, so I'm going to say the 14th century is the worst century in human history. Where to start? How about that 1 in 3 of you is dead in the space of 4 years? Like, I kind of feel like I could start and stop with the Black Death. I'm sure, I know there have been other plagues that have been catastrophic, but there's a reason this captures the imagination to this day. I mean, that within the space, really, it's just about 4 years. And really, it's just like in each of these communities, it's much shorter than that. And then it progresses north, in this time period. I mean, it utterly changes life. I mean, it is entirely mysterious. It reshapes the economy. It reshapes society. It causes people to question everything from theology to the structures of society and social relationships to authority figures to gender to the nature of equality. I mean, it's like all these repercussions are going to move outward, end the Middle Ages, and usher in modernity. And it's not just in Europe. I mean, it's equally catastrophic in the Islamic world and in Central Asia. And it keeps coming back for 300 more years after this. Martin Luther thinks that he's dying of plague in the 1520s in the middle of the Reformation. And that's only one of the events of the 14th century. We also have the Little Ice Age is starting, totally reshaping the environmental history of Europe, which leads to famine. And that will keep happening. That's going to help launch the French Revolution 400 years later because the rivers of France freeze and there's a food shortage and prices go up and it causes the revolution that reshapes the modern era. And we haven't even got to like the National War, the 100 Years' Wars. We haven't got to the schisms of the church, the Babylonian captivity. I mean, it's an utterly disastrous kind of century.
Mm-hmm. So and again, this is something artificial to this.
I kind of want to argue your side
that we're
actually,
doing here. The things you're talking about are terrible, largely natural disasters. Now, some of those things aren't, but I mean, your big hammer argument is a natural disaster.
Yeah.
Both the Little Ice Age and the plague, like those aren't. I mean, without giving this a lot of thought, I jumped to something like the 20th century as a century of genocide, and not just the Holocaust, but a century of genocide. I look at and that's global. Mm-hmm. I look at 2 world wars, the using of machines to systematically and militarily destroy armies, destroy civilians, destroy cities. Not to mention atomic bombs. Not to mention the anxiety around that. Not to mention the fact that we have reached a point. And I'm not a historian of technology, so I don't know that this. Somebody could probably make a counter case to this, but I think that we, in the 20th century, we began the development of technology at a rate that and this is the world we're wrestling with right now, that we cannot understand the meaning of what this is doing to us. So, I would argue you might look at, there's lots of things great about the 20th century you could talk about, but there's lots of things you could talk about in terms of the origins of the Renaissance happening in the 1300s. But I think, if we were to go 1,000 years from now, we might look at the 20th century as about as bad as you could get, because we don't even know the meaning of some of the stuff that humanity has experienced over this time. And I think our relationship to technology is a huge one.
Sure. And I mean, I don't want to minimize the catastrophes of the world. I mean, it's been estimated like 180 million people died human hands in the 20th century. 3% of the world's population is killed just by World War II, like 27,000 people a day on average. But that's versus like 25 to 50% of the population. I mean, it's like just the scale of suffering is so terrible in the 14th century that, the 20th century, I feel like I can make lots of pretty strong counter arguments of progress, even though they're mitigated by not just world wars, but especially genocide.
And to me, it's the human creation and the breakdown. I have deep a lot of this has to do with deep technological concerns.
Yeah.
I think that's where I would make that argument.
All right. Well, you guys are going to have to make an argument and vote who won each of these, and then from that we'll derive the total winner. And you all get to make your own case. So your discussion board assignment for this week is to make a different kind of case having to do with a best-selling book called The Benedict Option. So this is something that's been floating around really for about 10 years it really goes back to a philosopher in the 1980s, but it's been popularized by a conservative writer in Louisiana named Rod Dreher, who's a Catholic convert to Eastern Orthodoxy. He's been blogging about this for about 3 years, and then earlier this year, his book, The Benedict Option, finally came out. It shot right to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. He's been featured in secular magazines like The New Yorker, The Atlantic, plus lots of Christian publications. So you can find more about this on Moodle, links to some of his writing. But, I mean, in short, what he's arguing is a kind of historical analogy. Just like Benedict of Nursia saw civilization collapsing all around him in the 6th century as the Roman Empire in the West gave way to the Middle Ages, and withdrew then to this mountain, to Monte Cassino, and built a new Christian community. Dreher argues that we're living through civilizational collapse, that if you are a traditional, historically Orthodox Christian, things are figuratively falling apart around you. And so what's needed is a kind of disciplined withdrawal. Now, what that means, and he would reject the word retreat, but rethinking our relationship to politics, to mass media, to educational systems. What that means is a recommitment to disciplined, intentional Christian community, if not monastic community, kind of recommitting to your local church, your faith community, whatever it is. And so you're going to have to make the case. Do you think this is actually a good strategy, as it says here, a strategy for Christians in a post-Christian nation? So you have until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning to write your response. Here we really do want to emphasize the notion of a discussion board. So I'll set up a couple of threads and you can respond to them. If you're one of the first there, just give your opinion. But if you're picking this up like the morning it's due, don't just start a new thread. Don't just offer it as if no one has said anything else. You need to respond to what your fellow students and professors have been saying as we debate what's really, like it or not like it. This has really been a conversation piece in a lot of Christian communities this year, and probably will be for a couple of years to come. Okay, we'll be right back with our closing segment. Okay, Amy, it's happy time. Clearly I'm winded because I need 2 different kinds of caffeine.
That was a lot of caffeine
to get me through this. Okay, so happy birthday to Amy. I can't decide. If you want to riff on Sandy Patty, the singer who's turning 61, or fitness guru Richard Simmons, who's turning 69.
This is a tough choice.
And I do have a third option if you'd rather.
Really? What's the third option?
So, actor Topher Grace turns 39 of that 70s show fame.
I have a lot to say about that one.
Well, here's the question, Amy. I've entered my 40s now. Is it too late for me to move on from Chris and make Topher happen?
Not at all.
Can I do this?
Yep.
Can I just be Topher?
And then we'll just call you Toph.
I don't know.
But you got to emphasize the F.
Topher. Okay.
What's up, Toph?
All right, that was a good start.
Gosh, I have a lot of Sandy Patty memories. Grew up with Sandy Patty. I've been to 2 Sandy Patty concerts, as a matter of fact. I actually sing one of my kids a Sandy Patty song, often at night at bedtime. So
I know this was in your wheelhouse.
It really is. No, I'm a big lover of Sandy Patty. But I think it's probably time to be done, maybe a little bit. I can't believe she's 61.
Yeah, she's got to be active, right? Yeah. Concerts.
Okay. Golly, that is crazy. Right. And then, everybody loves Richard Simmons. And I actually have in my podcast queue, do you listen to podcasts?
Not as much as
Okay, I know Sam does, but there's one everybody's been telling me about called Finding Richard Simmons.
Oh.
And I have it in my queue. So I'm excited to see what that's about. But
all right.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything to?
No, that was a question for you. I have nothing to say about Sandy Patty or Richard Simmons.
All right, fine. Well,
okay, your turn.
Whatever, Toph. Yes. Okay. So happy anniversary to King Henry VIII and his 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, who wed this day in 1543. Chris, we rank everything and everyone on this show. Students, you know that. Can you rank the 6 wives of Henry VIII?
I'm going to make this easy on myself and say it's in bad taste to rank people who were beheaded.
Okay.
I think. So I'm just going to take Anne Boleyn and I think it's Catherine Howard, numbers 2 and 5, out of the conversation. I have nothing funny to say about that. I don't know anything about Anne of Cleves, number 4, so I'll take it. So I'll give you your top 3 Henry VIII wives. Is that enough, or am I shirking my responsibility?
I think it's okay.
We'll just say a tie for 4 with the others.
But someday when you get married, it goes better if you keep your head in the game.
Number 3, Jane Seymour, for 2 good reasons. Number 1, she was the 3rd wife. And number 2, she did an amazing job in Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. I love that show so much. I lived in France for 4 months, and every day at lunch I would come home to watch the French dub version of Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman.
That may be. Can you medicine? How do you say that?
It was so.
I bet you know.
It was so influential. The medicine. I don't know if there's a feminine version of that. I actually forgot what Jane Seymour's voice sounded like. I just like the dub version so much.
Yes. That may be one of the saddest things you've ever confessed. On camera or off?
I don't know what's watching this anyway. Number 2 is the first wife. Number 2 is the first wife, Catherine of Aragon. First of all, they had made the marriage work. Like, they were married for a good 20 years. It seemed to be decent. Like, they were at the time when Henry was not quite getting into the tyranny phase.
Midlife crisis.
Like, he was a good Renaissance prince.
Yep. She was smart.
She was very accomplished. You know, actually, I think generally is regarded as a pretty good queen in most respects, even by some of her enemies. So I'm going to give her number 2.
I like that. Number
1 is actually the person we're honoring here. Catherine Parr is a fascinating woman. Like, first of all, she survived. So, like, that's kind of
good. That's good.
Henry died 4 years in. Number 2, her uncle is Thomas Cranmer, which is
we'll
learn more about him.
I don't know much about Catherine Parr, I gotta admit.
There's actually a Wikipedia page called "The Wives of Henry VIII," which I might have looked at today.
Or adjusted.
Catherine Parr was married 4 times. Henry was her 3rd husband.
Did they all die? Were these a series of... Okay.
And her 4th husband was the brother of Jane Seymour. And she was the first English queen to write a book in her own name. She translated Psalms from Latin and then wrote another book, a kind of work of sort of Protestant sort of version of Confessions.
Wow. The extent to which you enjoyed the research for this little bit is something
amazing / depressing. Okay. Happy Trails to Alexander Hamilton, the $10 founding father, who died this day in 1804 for wounds received in a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr. That's still kind of amazing.
It is kind of amazing.
Amy, is the Broadway musical Hamilton overrated?
Hamilton musical? What are you talking? Just kidding.
How much would you pay me not to rap Hamilton right now?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, what do we have in our pockets?
It's
I sadly don't have anything. Oh, there we go.
I'm going to take a scholarship to King's College. I probably shouldn't brag, but Dake, I'm amazed and astonished. The problem is I got a lot of brains, but no polish. I'll stop. So we listen to this every single day, at least 2 or 3 times a day in my whole sabbatical. My kids to this day know the entire musical, and it's actually now becoming bad parenting.
That is definitely something Toph would do. That's just what I want to say about that.
Crossed over.
No, but I don't think it's overrated. And mostly, I was thinking about this. I think that Hamilton has done for musical theater a little bit of what Harry Potter did for reading amongst youth. In that, I don't know anybody who I think I probably know 4 people who've seen Hamilton, who have been to New York in the last couple months and have seen Hamilton because it's going to be starting its national touring soon. So, and I assume it would come to Minneapolis.
Eventually,
we get good theater here. But There is no such thing as a negative review of Hamilton, and I even know people who are not theater people and were blown away by it. And since I love musical theater, my guess is that I will go in as a skeptic because I will say people ruined this for me. They've built it up too much in my mind, and I'll probably love Hamilton too. So no, Hamilton. I mean, the fact that musical theater just is such a hot topic because of Hamilton is something I think is
agreed.
Yeah.
Did I win? Oh, that's not a game. I'm sorry.
Yep, you win.
And
a couple other competitions I can think of you won today.
Okay. All right. Yes. So as we wrap up, first of all, a reminder, you can always email us with your thoughts about what we talked about, or you can put that on the course extension board. Discussion board reminder, you do have another assignment due. Make your case for or against the Benedict option by tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Amy, you want to make
you can't make a case for the Benedict option by not answering the question and saying, I was just choosing the Benedict option.
Can't withdraw. Amy, you want to make a last-ditch effort to...
Oh, yeah, send us your Backman photos. I know. Okay, here's the thing, students. Sam and Toph didn't even want to do this because they said nobody will send pictures. We did it a couple years ago and people actually sent them, and then we tried again last year and no one sent them. And so I advocated for this. I was like, no, people will send them.
Amy had faith in you.
I had faith in you, and I still do. It isn't too late. So brush the dust off of that Backman text. As I said, get it out from under the seat of your grandmother. Bring it, show it to us. Remember, because the student let her grandma sit on it in the car. Because nobody has phone books anymore. So
No.
what do? You use your Backman text is exactly what you do.
Sure
So anyway, send us and it will be. I will give a prize. So right now you could just instantly be a prize winner because
Wow.
if we only get one
Yeah. No
instant
contest.
prize, there you go.
All
So
right.
please help us out. I don't make shameless pleas when it comes to these competitions because, as I always say, I like to let my work stand for itself. But in this case, I'm making a shameless plea that do it for me.
Okay, so don't let Amy down. Please send in your Backman pictures.
Or tofu wrap again.
Wow, that cinched the deal because no one wants to see that again. All right, it's been a great webisode.
It
I think we
certainly
can
has.
say.
Oh,
Hopefully you've
yeah.
enjoyed it as much as you loved the Middle Ages. We're about to head into the Renaissance and the Reformation. Got a test coming up in a little while, but we're not quite there yet. So we'll see you on another webisode before then. Until then, tof out.